freedom shall be restored to all. We abate nothing of our just demands. Not one jot or tittle do we recede.
You ask what is our policy? I will say it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might, and with all the strength that God can give us.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
Here at the junction of Westminster and Whitehall stands this statue, this memorial to Winston Churchill, one of the most celebrated and remembered individuals of the 20th century. Wartime Prime Minister of Great Britain and its empire during the Second World War. He dominated Parliament and the executive branch. But many of the most important decisions taken by Churchill and his war cabinet during those war years were made not in Parliament or in Downing Street, but beneath the ground, just a few hundred metres from where I'm standing now.
At the critical moment and out of crisis, Britain gets the war prime minister of her desire. The man to beat Hitler is Winston Churchill.
Ever since Germany marched into the Rhine and the era of power politics began all over again, Lord Nuffield said, "God help you if war comes."
As tension on the continent mounted, it became clear that Europe was heading back into war. The British government realised that it needed a safe, secure, protected location to maintain the functions of government in the event of massive airstrikes on London that might destroy buildings above the ground. And this basement in Whitehall was selected. This is not, in fact, a bunker. This is only a basement level. It was a storage cellar. And it was repurposed in the late 1930s to become a place where government could retreat to in the event of an air raid. The chiefs of staff met down here. The military functions of government gathered down here. There were communications installed, map rooms installed, so that information could be gathered together from around the world, which would then support the decision-making by senior military and political figures at the time. These cabinet war rooms had quite a quiet first few months of the war. There was no bombing of London. Winston Churchill didn't actually like it down here when he became Prime Minister in early 1940. He liked to portray himself as a leader not cowering below the ground, but above ground, facing his enemy. But when bombs started falling on London in September 1940, and particularly October 1940, when 10 Downing Street was very badly damaged, it was clear that government needed to move underground. And that's when it entered its heyday. The cabinet war rooms, the war cabinet would meet down here, the small committee of senior politicians from both parties, Conservative and Labour, who in coalition would run the war effort, make the big decisions that would affect the outcome of the war. And also down here were the chiefs of staff, Army, Navy, Air Force. And information flowed from all over the world, all the different battlefronts, into here, were presented to the Prime Minister and the War Cabinet, who could then make their decisions. It was not a particularly well-designed building. It was just a refitted basement after all. As it turned out, these little kinks and turns were quite useful. In the event of it being London being overrun by enemy forces, these were actually quite useful, the places where you could defend this building and would stop machine gun fire from reaching the length of these corridors. But it was never particularly designed. It wasn't hugely designed for habitation either. It wasn't a very popular place to sleep. Churchill himself slept down here rarely. He preferred eating and sleeping in the splendour of the Whitehall buildings above, and the electric lighting, the noise of the air conditioning, the heat, the people using the chemical flush toilets. It wasn't a wonderful place to spend time during the war, but it became home to many, many people who remember living down here during those long war years. The lights here were turned on the outbreak of war in 1939, and they were not turned off until the end of the war in 1945.
A picture of the King and the War Cabinet. This is the first time such a film has been taken. Of course, both King and Cabinet have been introduced to the screen before, but this is the first camera study of King and Cabinet together. Most members of the Cabinet are so well known to you that it'd be superfluous to name them. So, if you don't know them, you better ask someone in the next seat quietly.
And this is really the heart of the Churchill War Rooms. This is one of the most important and special rooms in Britain, I think possibly anywhere in the world. This is where the War Cabinet met. The slimmed down group of men that would direct the course of the Second World War, make all the biggest decisions that concerned Britain and our armed forces. 115 War Cabinet meetings occurred down here. This is the chair that Winston Churchill sat in and presided over those meetings. Some say dominated those meetings. And what's amazing, this original chair, you can see the grooves, the scratches that his worried fingers made in this chair as he dealt with the most important and gigantic issues ever taken by a British Prime Minister. And there's his cigars. So, of course, he had an ashtray, as he did everywhere he went. He smoked up to 10 cigars a day. But also, it's not just him. Look at all the other ashtrays. So we can imagine this room would have been filled with smoke. It would have been so stuffy as they were deliberating what was going on in the war. And Winston Churchill liked this room. He arrived down here in May 1940 and became Prime Minister. And he immediately said, "This is the room from which I will direct the war." And he certainly did try and direct the war, much to the frustration of many of the men sitting around this table. We have Clement Attlee here, his Deputy Prime Minister. You have the head of the Civil Service there. But look, these three chairs here are vital. These three chairs were occupied by the head of the Army, the Navy and the Air Force. They were brought in here to report to their civilian overlords as to what was going on in the war, and then listen to their suggestions, their criticisms and their instructions. And Churchill, sitting in this chair, could be brilliant, but he could be infuriating and he could be outlandish as well. It was the job of everyone in this room to try and direct Churchill's brilliance towards successful outcomes. I love the way this clock has been set to show a few minutes to 5 o'clock, which is exactly the time that the first War Cabinet meeting held down here was about to take place, about to start in October of 1940 as bombs were raining down on London from above. And it was in this room, this was the nerve centre, this room was the brain of the British Empire, the world's largest empire, one of the most important protagonists in the Second World War. And the decisions that were made in here affected not just the course and outcome of the Second World War, but the whole of history subsequently.
Behind Mr. Churchill, the country rallies solidly and resolutely to the task of defeating the most sinister madman that ever aspired to world conquest.
This is Churchill's bedroom. This is where he'd come and sleep at night. Not very often, only about 3 times during the war, we think, but he would have his afternoon naps down here. He was a man of very unconventional sleeping and resting habits. He would lie in the bed and dictate to secretaries. Chamber pot down there, he referred to those as a gazunder, because it goes under the bed. He's sleeping there with one of his beloved maps at his head. And then he would also work in his desk. And although he preferred sleeping in the more luxurious Downing Street annex above, he would come and work down here. And we've got broadcasting equipment. This is where he would sit and make some of his most famous radio addresses to the nation. Probably the thing that we associate most with Churchill's wartime leadership, rallying the nation through those powerful speeches that he gave on the radio. And the first speech he gave down here was just a few days after the giant German assault on London, early September 1940. And he addressed the nation to tell them just how desperate things were and how they should bend themselves to their duty. And he wrote, "Therefore, we must regard the next week or so as a very important period
in our history. It ranks with the days when the Spanish Armada was approaching the Channel and Drake was finishing his game of bowls, or when Nelson stood between us and Napoleon's Grand Army at Boulogne."
He was stealing the British people, preparing them for the fight of their lives by saying that no other episode in previous British history compared in importance with what was going on right now.
The war rooms are still filled with details that show what life was really like working underground.
I like this little feature here. Once it was realised when all the staff moved down here that there was no connection with the outside world, They put this here just as a way of letting people know what the weather and the conditions were like above ground. And one of these says windy. In fact, that was not about the wind strength up above ground. It was a slang for scary. So if this said windy, you knew that bombs were dropping on London. Remarkably, despite all the activity down here, word of its existence never got out. It remained a secret throughout the rest of the Second World War. The Germans never found out about it in particular, and that was lucky because they never tried to bomb it, because if they had, they would have enjoyed quite a lot of success. Because at the outbreak of war, this place was not particularly strongly constructed. One well-aimed German bomb would have penetrated through the ground floor and wreaked havoc with the people working away down here. And that's why when Winston Churchill found that out in December of 1940, he ordered things to change pretty fast. And vast amounts of steel and concrete were laid to turn this into a slightly more impregnable bunker. This is a section of the concrete that you can see. And when it was taken over by the Imperial War Museum at the end of the 70s, the early 1980s, as they began to turn it into this fabulous museum, they actually burrowed through this stretch of it, and it took them months. Look at the depth of concrete here.
Here to help show me the highlights is Imperial War Museum historian James Taylor.
What happened in this room? It feels important.
It is important. This was the nerve centre of the Cabinet War Rooms, and actually also the most secure area. So it's the map room, and what happened here was that these three chaps were duty officers who would compile kind of a scoreboard of the war as it progressed day by day. And what their job was to produce a report for the King, the Prime Minister, and the Chiefs of Staff. It had to be ready by 9 a.m. every morning.
So that meant they would largely work through the night?
They did often work through the night. They worked on a rota. These are the tools of their trade in front of them. These phones were known as the beauty chorus, because you'll see here there are lights in front of some of them. That was to stop the din from constantly ringing phones, so they'd be going on and off. The phones that you can see these gentlemen holding, they were actually connected to a scrambler, and we know that because they've got the green handles and the black boxes as well.
So those are ultra safe.
That's right, so that they can phone number 10 or phone one of the service ministries. The other thing that is also here, you can see a visor. These lights have been dimmed for conservation reasons. These are all original documents in here, so we don't want them to deteriorate. But actually the lights would have been very, very bright in here, and so hence the visor to help them see while they're plotting out what's going on where across each of the theatres of war.
Everything I've seen down here suggests it was quite a harsh environment to work.
Yeah, it was. I mean, obviously there's the smoke, there's the hubbub. It's very quiet while we're down here now. You would have had people constantly coming in, checking for reports, not least Churchill, who loved a map. So he was in here very, very regularly, checking what was going on. And of course, when this place was operational, particularly in 1940-41, a lot of the news wasn't very good.
The Battle of London, which began with strong forces of Nazi bombers attacking the capital at night, led to a big fire on the waterside early in the onslaught. Londoners watching the blaze knew that Hitler and Goering now challenged them.
He's always in a state of agitation, wanting to come in, wanting to know what's going on. And there were only 50 people had security passes for this place.
So this was top secret?
This was absolutely top secret.
And you've got all of the war, I mean, it's amazing. It's in some ways very modern, because you've got instantaneous communications. You've got all of those different fronts,
yes,
all over the world, reporting in exactly what's going on.
That's right. And I think one of the amazing achievements, you think of this is a world war, the breadth and depth of the information that these people are having to sift and make a kind of cogent report so that it's easily read every day by the people who need to know.
Are all the objects in here original?
They are, absolutely. Everything that you see in front of us here is original.
So they just turned the key in the lock in 1945 and...
That's right.
And you guys came and rescued it all?
That's right. I mean, the museum started discussions about taking over this site in the 1970s, and it opened to the public in 1984. But in the intervening period, nearly 40 years, only VIPs were taken down here by number 10.
So it was just mothballed.
Absolutely, yeah. So what you're seeing here is a time capsule.
Wow. Look at the holes all over this. What are they pinning in here?
Well, each of these pinpricks represents the progress of a convoy.
Wow.
So this to me is one of the most incredible objects in this museum. So what this represents here are those vital North Atlantic convoys that keep Britain going with food, with supplies from North America. And I suppose for me there's also a real poignancy about this, that this also represents loss of life as well, that often they just have to take a pin out when significant numbers of ships from a convoy are lost. So you're talking 70,000 dead Allied sailors here, as well as 30,000 dead U-boat crew throughout a battle that lasts from the beginning of the war right to the end. And of course, also, it's the U-boat threat that is Churchill's greatest fear and keeps him awake at night.
He would be coming in here,
Yeah.
and he'd go and check on how the convoys were doing.
This is exactly it. So I think it's a very moving object, as well as something that, in its time, had a very practical use.
But I'm only just understanding, when I look around this room, you realise that you've got the U-boat war, you've got the air war, you've got updates on bombs dropped in one place.
Yeah.
It's like today with the internet, you look up a website with all different analytics. Today you've got that, but in this space here.
In this space, I mean, you just think of the amount of information that's coming through here, and the skill that these chaps here are having to use to process that and to deliver it in a way that is easily read by the people that need to know.
And without that information, you can't make proper decisions about what you ought to be doing. The political and the military commanders can't decide what to do.
This is exactly it. And I think, you can see the intensity of activity in some areas. I mean, if you look here, we have Gibraltar. You've got the convoys passing through this very narrow strip of water here. So they've overlaid.
They've had to repair it.
This is exactly it.
So Winston Churchill was able to walk into this room and within a few minutes was able to get a visual update on how this global conflict was going.
That's exactly right. I mean, one of the things about Churchill, of course, was that he loved detail. And I wondered, how far these duty officers would have had to swerve him away from the detail, because, very often things like, for example, Enigma decrypts were not given to him in the round, because otherwise he might alight on something that might not be quite as important as he saw it being.
I can imagine him coming over here and trying to reroute convoys.
That's right. Yes, because of course he's a military man, he's a naval man as well, and this kind of thing, he wants to be in the thick of things. When you think about Churchill himself as a young man had seen service in 5 different conflicts. It was only natural that he should want to be more fully involved in this, not just as Prime Minister and Minister of Defence as he was, but also as a soldier and a sailor himself.
We think today of data analytics being very, very modern and 21st century, but that's what this entire room is about. It's trying to work out exactly what's going on. And I love the idea, in the middle of the North Atlantic, in the middle of the winter, your convoy's getting battered, and yet it's being meticulously plotted back here in distant London.
That's right, yeah. It's an incredible undertaking, really.
It turns out that one of the most important rooms of the whole war was also one of the smallest.
There's the great man himself.
Yes, here he is, and he's actually in a room that was disguised as a toilet.
Okay.
This had been a broom cupboard, but what happened was that from 1943, Churchill needed somewhere he could speak securely to the US President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and the scrambling equipment that enabled him to do that was actually housed in the basement of Selfridge's department store. It was huge, probably about 6 or 7 metres long, so there's no way it could have been accommodated here. And of course the thing is, Churchill had a very close professional and personal relationship with the US President, and was so relieved when the United States came into the war in December 1941. And he recorded in his memoirs, he said, "I slept the sleep of the thankful and the saved."
And he would, do you know how long these conversations would go on for?
Not sure. He would sometimes sit with somebody who would check the content as they were talking, because Churchill, get carried away talking about anything that might be highly secure and could be a matter of concern. But one of these people did actually say that actually Churchill seemed to spend a lot of his time talking about what he'd had for lunch.
This is one end of a particularly historic hotline between those two leaders.
It is, and one of the concerns that Roosevelt had, though, was that Churchill would call him at all hours, given the hours that Churchill kept. So his end of the line was installed at the Pentagon, not at the White House, as Churchill would have preferred.
Very sensible.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's almost unprecedented that two great powers have this ability to chat on the phone during the course of a war. I mean, I can't think of a previous example.
No, it's not. And I think that this is, without wanting to exaggerate it, it's this communication between the three big allies, despite their disagreements, so Britain, the Soviet Union and the United States, that helps the Allies to win the war, because the Axis don't have any communication like this whatsoever. They're just thrown together by the convenience of wanting to defeat the Allies, but they don't meet up or speak with each other in the same way that Churchill and Roosevelt, as here, and Stalin do.
So this old broom cupboard,
yes,
pretty important place.
It is. For a broom cupboard, that isn't bad.
On the 9th of August 1945, just a few hours after the dropping of the atomic bomb on Nagasaki, the British Prime Minister gave orders that this map room was to be closed. The staff, the maps, the intelligence operation would be transferred to roomier digs above ground. And the last day of operation would be August the 16th, 1945, which, as it turned out, was the day after VJ Day, the end of the Second World War. And that calendar has remained frozen on that date ever since, when the phones and the typewriters went silent. Welcome to the History Hit YouTube channel, which we are relaunching. We've got all the best exclusive content going straight onto this History Hit YouTube channel. And you can find out, for example, why on earth I'm standing at the top of this mast. You should probably subscribe.